Thank you. So today hi everyone, first of all. I'm going to be talking about what we did in Team 3 in the political analytics hackathon we had yesterday. My name is Alex. I'm a student in the college studying computer science. We also have Nick Ahmed, who is an analyst at the political data firm Civis Analytics. Nate Cohn is a writer for the New York Times Upshot, who we had earlier today on a panel. And Melissa Sands is a graduate student about to finish her PhD here at Harvard on how everyday context changes political behavior. So yesterday we didn't have much time. We had 6 hours of the data set. We've decided to look at the question of how racial resentment or racial conservatism affected the 2016 election. Now, in fact, our ambition had been to formulate a model which could actually, you could change the level of racism in the American electorate for 2016 and see how that affected the result. In 6 hours, we were not able to quite do that. There were some problems matching the data sets between the two data sets. I can talk about that in a second. But we do have some interesting findings I would like to share. So first of all, the CCES study, which measured over 60,000 people before and after the election, asked a lot of questions. It includes these three: to what extent do you agree with those three statements? Now, using these responses to these questions, we create a racial conservatism or racial resentment scale from 1 to 5, where 5 is the most racist answer possible. Now, bear in mind that as a racial resentment scale, it may not be perfect because these questions don't, for instance, ask directly about the Muslim ban, which is a huge issue in the 2016 election, for instance, and also very racially charged. So bearing that in mind, we went on to try and create 3 models, which were basically, the first one is a regression on those variables to see what factors explain the racial conservatism scale score for those individuals. And second, and the third models were trying to predict those vote choices in 2016 and 2012 among those voters separately using those covariates and racial conservatism. And the idea of developing those models was so that we could try and impute and attribute some of these predicted values, possibly for individuals, of probability of switching and the probability that they turned out was motivated by racial conservatism, for instance. So firstly, I would like to take a look at this graphic in particular, which is interesting because, as you can see, that Trump captured about a third of the mid-range racist Obama voter. But he's capturing 46% of the most racist Obama voters. Now, however, Clinton is only capturing 38% of the least racist Romney voters. And if you look just on the left-hand side, the 1 to 1.5 is the least racist answer you can possibly give. And those are the same questions administered to Obama 2012 and Romney 2012 voters. So those are same level racists. But Clinton is not capturing very many of those, as you can see. Now, something else that's interesting, which is not on this slide, but just as interesting we found, was that self-reported voters, people who said that they voted in 2012, now those people were more racist than the 2016 voters overall, according to this measure of racial conservatism. So just quickly, there are some maps here which can show those values when distributed across the states. And basically, if you have looked at this issue before, these maps will be fairly familiar to you. They basically are telling a similar story, which is the southern states are generally more racist, whether you're looking at just Romney voters or just white voters, for instance. Don't compare the map colors directly, just because the scales do change from like the darkest color being 3.05 for the Romney voters and 2.7 amongst white voters in general. However, this last one is extremely interesting, I think, because if you first imagine that the country contained only white Obama voters, this is the map that you get when you shade the states according to the average racial animus score in that state. So here you're finding that the most racist white Obama 2012 voters live basically in the Rust Belt and Nevada. Now, just also things to bear in mind is that most racist in this context is a 2.1 on that scale, which is still below the mid-range racist score that we've mentioned before. But it still is interesting to see that the most racist were still in that area. Thank you very much for your time. Those were our findings. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our next panel on analytics and the 2016 campaign. So to begin with, we have Tim Miller, who is a partner at Definer's Public Affairs and specializes in communications and digital strategy. We're starting over on the far left, by the way, my far left. So he served as the communications director most recently for Jeb Bush 2016 and a senior advisor to the GOP's leading anti-Trump super PAC, Our Principles. Then next we have Danny Diaz, who's a founding partner at FP1 Strategies and has worked at the highest levels of national political campaigns. Most recently, he served as campaign manager for former Florida Governor Jeb Bush's presidential campaign. We now have Matt Lackey, who is the Vice President of Research and Development at Civis Analytics, a political data science firm. Previously, he led the analytics team at the AFL-CIO from 2009 to 2013 and worked on the 2008 Obama campaign. And we also have John Sides, who is an associate professor of political science at George Washington University. He also helped found and now contributes to The Monkey Cage, a Washington Post blog about politics and political science. And finally, our panel will be moderated by Margie Omero, who is Executive Vice President of Public Affairs at PSB Research, an international strategic research company. She's also co-host of the popular bipartisan podcast, The Pollsters, which I'm personally a big fan of, and which explains the numbers driving each week's biggest news stories. So please join me in welcoming them to today.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here. This has been, and thank you to all the folks at Harvard who put on such a fantastic day today. Pretty much everyone on these panels has either been a past guest of the pollsters or a future guest of the pollsters, one we should really have on, all of you, or someone with a more popular podcast than the pollsters. So I'm very excited to talk to everybody. And I put on, everyone's been qualifying. Well, let me back up a little bit and say we've had a lot of discussion today talking about forecasting and predictions and the analytics that we have seen as public consumers of polling and whether it led us to believe about a certain Clinton was going to win, or whether we all wanted to believe that there was going to be Clinton win, whether there was an error in the data or in the coverage. And I think on this panel, I want to broaden that out a little bit because there was more than just the forecasting and the coverage, although that certainly pointed in a specific direction. It was really everything. It was the polling. It was the campaign's own internal polling. We had on the show Tony Fabrizio, the Trump pollster, and Joel Benenson, the Clinton lead pollster, on the show right after the election. And Fabrizio himself said, on election day, I thought it was a 55% chance that Clinton won. And you saw the Trump campaign on the air on election day really kind of indicating and kind of setting expectations for a Clinton win. So it seemed, based on the reporting and everything we've heard, that that across the board, the entire world thought Clinton was going to win. It wasn't simply because of where forecasters or some outlets had led people to believe. So then when thinking about what we were going to talk about today, I asked the folks on my Facebook feed, which is very representative. I know why people are all trying to qualify their Facebook feed as not representative. Mine is perfectly representative. But I said, what should I ask on this panel today? And the consensus was, everyone had phrased it in a slightly different, clever way, but the consensus was basically the question I'm going to start with, and we'll start with Tim, which is, why should we believe anything ever again going forward in terms of data? So Tim, why don't we start with you?
I'm a perfect person to start with for that, because not only was I unbelievably wrong in my predictions, but I was cocky and unbelievably wrong
but enjoyable.
in all my predictions.
It was very enjoyable.
So, I think that there were some differences about, which is understated, about Donald Trump's candidacy that contributed to part of this, which I think we can talk about a little bit more as the panel goes on. But the two main things, I think, that explains why the predictions and even the internal predictions were wrong in the general election were, one, there really was late movement. I know this is kind of a cliche a little bit, but whenever polling's wrong, you didn't catch the late movement. But Ed Goaz, who was the Republican, who was a pollster for the Republican pro-Trump super PAC, I saw him the Saturday before the election, and he pulled me aside and said, "Tim, I want to show you my internal numbers." And they were in the field Thursday, Friday, Saturday before the Tuesday, and his internal numbers had Trump winning Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, the presidency. I told him he was an idiot. And that he was just juicing the numbers to make his client happy. He said he didn't really even believe it to a certain degree, but there was late movement. He cited that based on one group in particular, which was 20% of the electorate, which was unprecedented, was unfavorable to Clinton and Trump both. Mm-hmm. And that those voters moved heavily towards Trump in particular in the end, and even more strongly in the key states that Trump flipped. The second thing, I think, which was more about why I was so cocky and wrong, was kind of this unbelievability bias, right? I mean, some people are getting used to Donald Trump being president. That's still pretty weird for me. I think that if you look at the precinct data, if you look at the county data for where Republican Romney voters left Trump, it was all the places where we all see each other. It was in the DC suburbs, it was in the New York suburbs, it was in Boston, it was in high college educated, Houston, Atlanta, Denver. It was my entire social circle. So to me, it was like, the Republicans I'm talking to are sketchy on Trump, so I don't, I can't imagine that this is not true everywhere. So I think those are the two main drivers with some unique elements of Trump mixed in. And the short answer to your question is no, you shouldn't believe anything anybody says. We're all full of it.
Okay, Danny?
Campaigns are obviously dynamic undertakings, and so there's a lot going on until the last moment. So, there were, a number of factors. I think the reality was that there were people that were being surveyed who weren't telling pollsters who they were going to support. I think that's fairly clear. I think, the late movement against Clinton with highly educated people based on, to some degree, what was in the news. I think all of this was happening. The plates were moving as we kind of neared the finish line here. And quite obviously, to a degree, that it kind of changed the outcome most people thought was going to take place. And the next thing is, to answer your question directly, for people that work on a lot of races, state races, congressional races, outside of just presidential races, you believe in the data because oftentimes that data is pretty damn close to exactly what the outcome is. I work and we work in my firm in enough races where I'm not, I don't lose a lot of sleep over kind of, are we kind of wrong in many cases. But there are contests that are very unique in nature, and it just so happens that presidential contests get outsized attention that sometimes challenge that. And I think the byproduct of that is good in that people like us sit in a room and we try and figure out why that is the case, and we have to up our game and learn kind of new skills, and some of that will be the byproduct of the 2016 election.
So when I think about answering this question, I think about trust, right? And there's what academics think about survey research or modeling or whatever, but what do practitioners think about us? And I think that it's built on trust. Have we gotten it right more often than not? Have we been honest and transparent with our findings? And one of the things that has stuck out to me since the election, and this is in no way spiking the football, but I remember a conversation that I had with one of our large clients in September which was not, oh, we think that Donald Trump is going to win. It was, oh my God, we think polling is broken, right? And that is not to say that we predicted the outcome, because we didn't. But if you are, if you're honest with, with practitioners and with campaigns, that there are limits to this work, and the error bars are bigger than we can, easily quantify, and the biases that exist in these, in this type of research are multitude. I think that trust is sort of preserved. Now, having said that, just because you say the house is on fire does not mean you know how to work a fire hose. So as long as we are consistent with, as long as we are consistent with our message that, like, this is not perfect. There's a whole lot that we are having trouble measuring because of non-response bias, because of social desirability bias, things like that. And you don't put everything in a black box. I think that there is there's a real opportunity to preserve that trust. And the other thing that I would say is that the great thing about elections is that they have a scoreboard. So a lot of people missed this cycle. We're going to have elections in a couple weeks in Georgia. We're going to have elections in Virginia and New Jersey in November. We're going to have primaries in 2018. There's a lot of opportunities to see if our industry is capable of solving this problem and adapting.
There was a moment in the first presentation where Amanda Cox showed the thing that the New York Times produced and let it run in real time. And I remember the moment at which I left the house that night to take a walk around the block and contemplate whether I had a professional future as a political scientist. My wife, who is in divinity school, will be ordained a priest in the spring, she was doing homework, and she heard me get up and say, honey, I'm gonna take a walk. And she said, is it that bad? And I said, yeah, it's pretty bad, from the standpoint of a guy who's given 6 talks predicting a Clinton victory this fall. And then she went back to her homework. So one message I had in that was, maybe I just spent more time thinking about God and less time thinking about politics. Like, I'd be a calmer person. I'll say that, so I would say this about Margie's good question. Had Clinton gotten about a percentage point more of the popular vote, she would have won the Electoral College. And we would have had a conversation about data and analytics that is the exact polar opposite of the one that we're having now. We would have had a conversation about how right it all was. We would have had the same conversation that we had about the Democratic and Republican parties that we had after the 2012 election, where the Growth and Opportunity Project's postmortem for the RNC basically said the Republicans need to invest in data. And so we would have had that same conversation, how Trump ran this totally incompetent campaign that didn't do all the things that modern campaigns do, like buy a voter file for a long time, and some other stuff, and we would have just come away with completely the opposite lesson on the basis of one percentage point more of the popular vote. Right, so I'm very conscious that we overinterpret every election, that we draw too many lessons from elections as a general rule. So I think the real lesson, I think, from this election is that data and analytics are the worst way to run a campaign, except for all the other ways of running campaigns, which is paraphrasing Winston Churchill's favorite quote about democracy. Nothing's going to change about the centrality of these tools. I think they're going to continue, as Matt suggested, to be thinking about how to do them better. But I mean, what are we going to, the thing about that I observed, and these folks are better situated than me to comment on this, but what I observe is that the Democratic Party culture, thanks to the Analyst Institute and a variety of other people, right, they're going to continue to do this work because they think it's extremely important, even more important now. And the Republican side, I don't think they're like, oh, well, thank God we don't have to do that data and analytics thing anymore that Trump won. I mean, all the down ballot races that Danny alluded to, right, all this work's already going on. They're going to build scores off models based on the voter file, right? They're going to test messages using surveys and maybe even experiments and stuff like that. So I don't think that the lesson really is all that different, even though some of the data didn't get it right this time around. I don't think that's really changed the sociology of the way that campaigns are working.
So then to tee off that a little bit, and this is a question for anybody, it doesn't have to be a question for everybody though on the panel, which is, do you think the answer going forward is that, there's a specific, perhaps satisfying reason that we can explain why the data in aggregate across D and R and different types of outlets was off? That if we, next time around we press this button instead of that button, we'll get it all correct? Or is the answer that, we are looking for too much precision? We are expecting too much precision from analytics, and we should be supplanting analytics and, polling that tries to find what the number is of the horse race with some more deep dive, long poll, longer polls, message testing, coming up with a full narrative around the race, qualitative, and so on, which for folks who are not practitioners is most of campaign polling. Campaign polling does not look like the stuff you see in the newspaper, which is really just 3 or 4 questions. Campaign polling really goes much deeper. So is there some kind of answer that we're going to find to say this is how analytics needs to be improved, or was the answer always that it's never going to be, we can't expect it to hit the nail right on the head, we need to look at these other things? Anybody?
I feel like the answer to are we going to find the problem is very easy, and the solution is very hard. So the answer to the problem of why did we miss is that people who take surveys are really weird, right? We know that survey response rates have been on a decline for the last 20 years, and it's gotten worse because the act of picking up a phone call from a stranger now when everyone has caller ID and talking to them for 20 minutes about politics when the majority of Americans don't care about politics is really, really strange, and we're expecting the people who opt into our surveys to stand in for the people who don't opt into our surveys. So I think that we're going to see that as everyone's going to do their own analysis. We're all going to congeal around the same idea that non-response bias is a real problem. Now the solution to that is, I think that it would be overly optimistic to say that we are going to solve the problem with one mode or nudging how we do survey research in any specific way. The world that we're going to live in is probably one where we have to expect that there's bias in every mode of survey research, and we just have to be mindful of that bias and take it with a grain of salt. And the other thing I would say, to more broadly, outside of just survey research measurement, is that the culture, and I believe that this is true on both the D and the R side, is built up around things that are easier to measure. And as we get into harder problems, we're going to have even less certainty about what the right answers are. And so we're going to need to triangulate with lots of different methods and just sort of own the biases that come with those.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I mean, elections are ultimately about humans voting for another human being, and sometimes you're not going to be able to nail it exactly. And sometimes in a close contest, momentum and things vary just to minimal degrees, and it determines the outcome. I mean, you can have the best sports car in the world. If you don't have a human being to drive it that knows how to drive it, you're not going to win the race. And so, at the end of the day, there's still people making decisions that in these races, starting with the candidate themselves, that determine the outcome. So I don't think I'm as dour on the industry and the work that's done. And I think, as I said, presidential contests are unique contests from the perspective of just the level of attention. And the first, I've done 4 of these things, and the thing that always strikes me is that it is an earned media contest versus every other race for every other office that is a paid contest. And so it is much harder to get your arms around that thing because there's so many more variables that are out of your control.
I would offer one thought, which is I wish there were a button to press to make it different. I'm not so much concerned that we can't diagnose the problem and maybe even address the problem or problems that led us to get this election not quite right. I think the 2 concerns that I really have are that the problem with this election will not be the problem with 2016, or 2020, excuse me. What year are we in, right? In other words, Nate Silver alluded to fighting the last battle, in his comments, and I think that's what we're going to basically do. We're going to say, oh, we got it wrong because of the white working class rural voters, so we got to figure out a way. All right, we're going to monkey with the survey weights, right, to kind of get them to adjust for this. And then we're going to find that 2020 is about something different. And so we'll go, we're going to fix that, okay? So, part of me doesn't really trust our ability to anticipate some of the challenges we might face in the future. And I think the other thing is, I think that there's a lot of variation right now in the technical, statistical, methodological, whatever you want to call it, sophistication of the campaign practitioner and polling community. I think there are people, a lot of them who are in this room, that have the tools to do the work that needs to be done to figure out what went wrong. I think there are media pollsters out there that don't know a lot about weighting and are just going to throw out polls because they can get a press release to get traction no matter what they say. I'm also concerned that sometimes in campaign, people who work in the campaign world know this very well. There are people that know how to do this work in campaigns, and there are charlatans, right? Who, because let's say they have a British accent, just hypothetically, right? Okay? They'll tell you that they can give you information about voters out of this information that they can't give you any reliable way.
They charge a higher retainer.
They charge a higher retainer. All right, so I think one of the challenges I think for the field on the campaigning side, that's a private sort of sector thing where they've got to figure out a way to develop a market for goods and services that produces like a reliable product, and eventually, presumably, the market economy will do its work over time. On the pollster side, I'm encouraged by the expertise that I see coming from the analytics community. I'm encouraged by the experimentation and expertise that I see at the Pew Research Center, by what the New York Times did, by giving its data to a bunch of teams and saying, what would you do with these data? What answer would you give, okay? And it differs between Clinton +2 and Trump +3 or 4. But that kind of sort of experimentation, drawing on, I think, a much more diverse and refined set of tools is really what we need to have happen. I don't necessarily think that the market for polling data in the news media and frankly among the public really provides a sufficient incentive to do that. The public wants to know what the answer is. The news wants a new poll to report on, and no one's really interested in whether your post-stratification weights were adequate for the task, right? So that's where I'm a little bit
Or even the
pessimistic.
rest of the questions past the horse race. Forget about how they weighted their data, which, there are lots of, folks who are kind of armchair poll critics out there. But looking at, a lot of the media outlets have really long surveys that go very, have traits, but they don't often get integrated into how they're reporting because they don't have the folks don't have the time or what have you. It just doesn't get kind of integrated into the story the way internal campaign might look at. Now I want to just add one data point to this conversation because it just came out today. It's not disputing what a couple folks have said, but because there's caveats in it. But just to add to this conversation about the shy Trumper and whether or not there's a social desirability bias to say that you did not vote for Trump. And we saw it, earlier today, which probably was, there may have been a little bit of that there. But Pew did a study, which they just released around 1 o'clock today, where they asked people, they randomized whether or not people were assigned to online versus phone. They asked a bunch of questions about Trump, and they asked a bunch of questions about a variety of policies. And they did see a mode effect among Republicans. They didn't see a mode effect among Democrats. So Republicans who were online were more likely to have further conservative views on things like immigration, which I think makes sense. But on views toward Trump, there was no mode effect. They're saying we can't say that this has a bearing on 2016 just right now. I think that's how I interpreted the results. So they're not saying that that's the final answer on 2016. But it's interesting that this experimentation keeps on happening, and we still have this. I want to believe it too, that that's an explanation for why the polls. That seems like a satisfying explanation as to why the polls were off among some populations, was that people didn't want to respond that way. But we still don't actually have a final answer on that fact. Now I want to ask about D's versus R's and the lessons from what happened in 2016 in polling, and D's and R's internally in our, smoke-filled rooms, integrating the lessons of 2016 appropriately or maybe incorrectly or overthinking them or underthinking them. There was a Democratic consultant who wrote a story in Politico, maybe folks saw it, about how data analytics is killing the Democratic Party. And one of the lines was that Democrats have allowed micro-targeting to become micro-thinking. That was one of the lines from this. And, Republicans in 2012, there was a Republican who went, with a blind quote in a Ron Brownstein story saying, Republicans will never try to run up the score with white voters as their strategy. We'll never do this again, I think was the quote. No one's ever going to try this again. But then, lo and behold, they tried this again and it worked. So are D's and R's learning the wrong lessons from 2016 or the right lessons? I mean, what do you guys think?
Well, to John's point, I think it was John earlier that said that he's skeptical of our ability to predict, how to fix things in the future. I can speak to that, especially as being one of the people that wrote the GOP autopsy in 2012. That was, thrown into the toilet and flushed down, and Trump did the exact opposite of the prescriptions that we laid out and won. So I think that based on that experience, there is probably good reason to think that the Democrats' prescriptions for how to fix, why they lost in 2016 and 2020, might not be right. And I think that this, thinking about the challenges with the polling, as somebody who, is not designing instruments, right, but is thinking about how to look at data and communicate with it. The thing that is more challenging for me, looking ahead to 2020, is I'm worried a little bit less about the fact that, and the pollsters missed one state, right, Pennsylvania. Like there were no polls in the field in Wisconsin or Michigan for the last 2 weeks, so that it's conceivable that the polls in those states might have been more accurate had there been timely data to reflect it. And so the thing that concerns me more is the testing of the messages that the Hillary Clinton campaign did. I mean, they spent more money and had a bigger investment in analytics than any campaign in history to try to figure out what messages were necessary to, put on television using their financial advantage and for Hillary to talk about in speeches in order to beat Donald Trump, and they were completely wrong. And I think that was a kind of I forget the quote you said about, being obsessed with micro-targeting, but there was kind of a myopic view of the data, I think, where if you looked at, we saw this with our principals pack, if you looked at the data and how people responded to Trump, what they always said was the thing that bugged them the most about Trump was the gaffes. Those were the things that always polled the best, right? Those were the ads that always tested the best. Those are the messages that always worked. But because of what Danny was saying, how this campaign, there was so much discussion about all of that in the media, for then the Clinton campaign to base their messaging around that clearly was completely wrong, right? And ended up turning off some voters and driving them into Trump's arms, which Sean mentioned on the last panel. So I think Democrats need to be really cautious about that, looking ahead to 2020, and learn some lessons for that, and maybe take more of a 30,000-foot view of how they can change people's opinions about Trump, because nobody's cracked that nut.
Okay. Anybody else? Go
Yeah. I think that if you orient a campaign around a monolithic support score or turnout score or whatever, like obviously it's not going to work because this is a dynamic system. Things are hard to model. I don't believe. I mean, obviously, I'm financially incentivized to say this, but like, I don't believe that analytics has like run its course and we should stop measuring things. I think that what we need to do is adapt, and I think that this is just a problem that is going to be sort of solved over the next couple cycles. We focus on horse races and narrow persuasion experiments and forecasting and all of these things that are like, as I mentioned earlier, these easy to measure problems. And there are much bigger problems about, comprehensibility and contagion of messages and, like what works in a dynamic conversation and what happens when you disintermediate the communication such that it's not coming from an institution but coming from a friend. These are hard problems that we, don't have a principled, measured way to give guidance on, and I think that that's where the industry needs to go if it wants to stay relevant. Like, if if all we do is say, like, you're 75% likely to support Hillary Clinton, that's a parlor trick. That's not strategic guidance. And, like, the industry needs to move past that for sure.
Do you think that there's something specific about views toward race and identity that models and polling didn't catch? Because I know what you're talking about, Tim, where the things that people knew about Trump and that you saw work in public polling, and in terms of how the traits that were seen as most descriptive of Trump, all focused on the whole list of things, right, that he's done and said, the mercurial comments he's made. When there's been other work, I think it's the Wesleyan Media Project, or at least folks related to that project, so apologies if I'm misciting it, that have shown that when you call attention to some of the biases of Trump, it doesn't move white voters in particular, that there's this sense, perhaps it's a theory, that maybe there's some data to back it up, that calling attention to Trump's biases actually makes some people kind of dig in or respond negatively, saying, well, you're saying that if I support Trump that means I'm racist or I'm sexist. I don't really like being called that. That's upsetting to me. And obviously that presents a real challenge for folks on the left who say, well, these are real issues we need to talk about, and the fact that people aren't moving away from someone who says that is itself an issue we should really talk about. But nonetheless, that seems to be a feature in some of the polling, and I don't know if maybe that means we need to change how we're measuring. I don't know if other folks have seen that. Can we talk about that a little bit? Because that's, I think, one of the big themes of what we've seen this election is how big the issue of race and gender and identity was as a vote driver. Anybody want to tackle that one?
It's a big one. I think the environment oftentimes is the kind of preeminent indicator for what's going to happen in the race, right? And so it happens that, to his credit, Donald Trump ran in an environment that was very conducive to kind of his platform, his views, and whatnot. And I think in a lot of these places, kind of, there are things happening culturally that people just kind of haven't caught up with yet. And as these things are unfolding in our society, I think there were a lot of people who were like, they wanted to kind of press the pause button a little bit. He kind of represented some of that. And you look in the industrial kind of Rust Belt, there are pockets in those places that very much represent that. And that there's not anything wrong with that. That's a reality. And some of that was unfolding kind of underneath the surface as kind of the race was taking place. And, I think it was coupled with Hillary Clinton just kind of totally misplaying her hand, to be honest with you, in those same places where Barack Obama worked really hard to ensure that he delivered on those states. Her campaign took those places for granted, minus maybe Pennsylvania. I mean, you talk about data and analytics. Did you need data and analytics to tell you to go to Wisconsin when you were tied in Pennsylvania? You know what I'm saying? So there's an element here, once again, of you're running a race, like and applying common sense and understanding what's happening, and the data and the analytics and the polling and the theory of the race and constantly testing that and all of it is incredibly important, and kind of an understanding among the strategists within an endeavor that there's a common thinking, and where you deviate, working through that. But there's some pretty kind of obvious things that were at play in 2016 that, despite the billions of dollars spent, were overlooked, to be very candid with you. So I think there's a cultural element, kind of putting aside race and everything that you raised, that was definitely in play here.
I'd say she did worse than ignore it, actually. She needled them. Between the deplorables comment and then going back to what I'm saying about her advertising, Barack Obama's advertising in 2012 had a clear message for these voters, right, about the auto bailout, and Hillary Clinton's messaging in Ohio was mostly about Donald Trump's gaffes,
and Bain. And Bain and Mitt and all of that.
Yeah, well, in 2012. So I think that Hillary, almost kind of riled up that class of voter a little bit. I'd be curious Matt's point of view on this, because again, this isn't my area of expertise, but from talking to a lot of pollsters after the election, I think one error in the polling in 2012 that I think that folks thought might happen again in 2016 was these kind of Hispanic voters weren't getting polled, particularly in Nevada and Colorado, and Obama ended up outperforming these folks who are off the grid, so to speak. And I think that I sort of expected that to happen again in 2016, and that this demographic of voter, the sort of working class white voter, that the same phenomenon ended up kind of being the case with them. Unlikely 1 to 5, unlikely white working class voters, weren't responding to polls at the same degree, or weren't even being polled, oftentimes, and so they were being missed a little bit. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Matt.
Yeah, I can answer that, but I also have a really boring answer to Marty's question.
Perfect.
Excellent.
So we had a racial resentment model in 2016, and we were doing lots of randomized trials because that's the ethical thing to do. Can you see if there are heterogeneities along the racial resentment model based on what the creative is? Yes, and on ads that were sort of needling on the sort of identity politics side, like obviously there were significant heterogeneities along the racial resentment model, and on ads that weren't, there weren't. So I think that this is not something that we can say analytics totally missed. It's something that is really nuanced, and that's sort of unsatisfying. To your question about the Hispanic voters that were missed in 2012 and the white working class voters that were missed in 2016, to John's point, we're going to probably, unfortunately, solve last year's problem every time. But if you stare deeply into the abyss and say that, we have a crisis of measurement, I think that, and I hope that the smart people in this room and the smart people working on this problem in opinion research writ large are going to, start solving multi-mode survey research that, each mode has its own bias, and each mode probably captures different parts of demographics that, are opting in or choosing not to opt in, and we're just going to have to figure out how to synthesize those data so that we can actually get an accurate picture of the electorate. And one thing that I do want to sort of underscore about this is that this is not just a partisan political problem. I think that this is a problem for our democracy, because if we cannot accurately listen to the thoughts, feelings, and fears of the populace, then we're going to draw the wrong conclusions about how to govern. And so that's something that everyone on both sides of the aisle should be freaked out about and working on solving.
Do you think, and this, I'll start with John for this one, do you think that we maybe aren't thinking about enthusiasm correctly? If you think back to 2012, you saw a lot of Republicans arguing, well, Mitt Romney is going to do well because his voters are more enthusiastic. Maybe I'm remembering wrong, but I remember hearing that as part of the, they're going to turn out the more enthusiastic. That was part of the, Romney public polling.
That's what you call good spin.
Spin. Good spin.
That's all you call that, was good spin. You gotta say something.
I remember it 4 years later, so
you gotta get these interviews. You gotta say something. That's all that was.
Well, I believed it, and then this time around, if you looked at the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders had large crowds at his events before anybody else really had big crowds at his events. Trump had talked about excitement in his rallies. Now, measuring the size of a crowd is not projectable, right? Obviously. But is it reflective of something that needs to be thought about or challenge our assumptions? And how do you do that? What are your thoughts, John?
So, because you mentioned this question to me earlier, I wanted to read you my favorite quote from 2012, which is not one of Tim's, so he can rest easy. But there is this is a major national media outlet, which I will not name, nor will I name the reporter. But there is a tangible sense, seen in Romney yard signs, on the expensive expansive lawns of homes in the well-heeled suburbs, and heard in the excited voices of Republican mothers who make phone calls to voters in their spare time that the race is tilting toward Mr. Romney. That is on-the-ground reporting from Pennsylvania.
What's the date?
Pennsylvania, okay? November 1st, 2004.
So 3 days before the election.
Okay. So, so this is the question I think that Lynn asked Nate Silver and Nate Cohen about mixing the qualitative and the quantitative into some kind of magic thing where it's like the money ball, right? You take your data on base percentage and you take the scout sitting there going, well, I saw him, and he can't hit, And then you just sort of take that and you like put it together and magically you have a thing that tells you something closer to the truth than you would have gotten with on base percentage alone. Honestly, I wish that I knew a reliable way to take the kinds of things that people talk about. I went to a Sanders rally in Iowa on the night before the caucus. It was rocking. Not literally, just because there were actually rock music people playing, Yeah, so I just don't know how to distinguish signal from noise, in this domain. And I'm conscious about, for every time a Sanders rally turns out to indicate that he can actually overachieve, I would argue, relative to what he should have been able to do, or every time Trump rallies actually turn out to be maybe a harbinger of something meaningful, we're going to chase dang yard signs through the well-heeled suburbs of Pennsylvania, So in my mind, and this is part of why I fall back on data analytics is the worst except for all the others, is because I don't really know what all of the others are getting us. I do think that there are domains in campaigns and elections where qualitative knowledge proves to be useful. I mean, one of the things that Nate Silver talks about in The Signal and the Noise is Dave Wasserman of the Cook Political Report, who I'm sure many of you know, who is, because they interview all these congressional candidates, he listens to them talk to him and answer questions, and he gets a pretty good sense after 20, 30 minutes or whatever it is they do, 45 minutes, that this guy knows what he's doing or this woman knows what they're doing, or they don't, right? They don't understand policy, or they don't understand things very well. And I think that when Cook Political Report is factoring that into their race ratings, it actually is adding value over and beyond what the things that we can typically quantify, at least in political science. But the question is trying to identify which of that information is particularly relevant or useful. And I think a one-on-one conversation with a congressional candidate who otherwise is not getting much news coverage is giving Wasserman a lot of information that's otherwise hard to get. I'm not quite sure what we're going to get from these more qualitative indicators of campaign activity or enthusiasm that are oftentimes difficult to translate into an actual vote on election day.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? I mean, you could
Yeah,
put in
right.
that same bucket social media monitoring
Yeah,
or focus group data at some level. I mean, you could put a lot of things in that bucket.
Fundraising.
yeah.
Fundraising
That's
data.
right. Yeah. I mean, I think that, one, we're
Endorsements.
probably not going to get this answer out of the four corners of a survey because the people who take surveys are civically engaged, right? And so they're already ginned up about elections and care about politics in weird, unrepresentative ways. But the world is just getting more data driven. So what it means to have quantitative information now is so different than what it meant even 4 years ago, right? So what Margie was saying about social media monitoring, how much are people talking about politics is probably a good indicator. And even if it's not, even if it's not a direct input into your model, it can, it can sort of give you guidance on places to look. The same is true for any sort of engagement information, or as you were saying, fundraising data, right? If there's a ton of small dollar donors, those people are probably going to vote, right? So I think that we have to take a broader approach to what the role of quant is in campaigns to bring in all of these data sources and sort of figure it out that way.
You look at all of that, and then you do tests on the ground
Yep.
to see how many people are willing to go out before election day, and you do it. You set it up, and you do it numerous times over a period of time to see how many doors you're going to be able to hit, how many phone calls are you going to be able to make, and you have to test it and practice it. And everything that's been said here is true, and it's a way to measure the strength of an operation. and quite obviously, I mean, you would think that your opponent's doing the same thing, and then obviously you test your cars on election day. But yeah, everything that's been said is exactly right.
I would say one of the challenges that we face in actually getting a good sense of whether these other kinds of metrics are useful is that the people that monitor the metrics to tell us whether they're useful are, as you put it, financially incentivized to tell you that they are useful. And so I don't know how many firms sent me spam email during the campaign to tell me about their amazing social media monitor, right? They all have like some version of the same name as far as I can tell. And then sort of engagement and sentiment and all this kind of stuff and blah, blah, blah. And you go and you look at it, and it's like, yeah, something, lines that move and stuff, but it's really hard to know, like, what can we extract from that? I think the kind of testing that Dana describes is the way it's going to happen, but man, that's going to take some time and some real hard work to figure out, on average, if I am doing some kind of social media monitoring on Facebook or whatever, is that giving me information above and beyond other kinds of standard ways of measuring sentiment among voters? I don't know, and I just don't know the answer to that question, other than I know that people are going to tell us that it does, right?
So I have one last question, a quick question, and then we're going to open up to one or two questions before we're done. So when we think going forward, so I'm old enough to remember when there wasn't even a thing called political analytics, let alone a conference that had been going on for a couple of years, and a room full of people to hear panels all day about it. So this is new to the industry. So going forward, do you guys think of analytics as necessary and sufficient to a political campaign, necessary but not sufficient, or neither necessary nor sufficient? To put it in real analytical terms. So Tim, we'll start with you.
Start with me?
Yeah.
It's definitely necessary, not sufficient, of course. I mean, I think that there's kind of a, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes element to this. But, we've talked a lot about the negative stuff that's happening with analytics, but like on a micro level, the kinds of things, the kinds of, tests that the good campaigns on both sides are doing right now are really hugely valuable. And we didn't get a ton of time to talk about this, but the difference between the presidential race and a House race is so dramatic, right? Yeah. And you can use analytics and behavior modeling to really do some phenomenal things, identifying who your top volunteers are going to be, identifying what message to give to a certain voter on a certain door. And the paid advertising, at least for now, we'll see if that's true in 2022, still works quite well in these in these down ballot races. So and it's only going to get better. So yes, necessary, not sufficient.
Okay.
I agree with that. And then just the challenge in like running the thing is the volume of data, right? And it can drown you, right? And the integration of it, and it feels great when it is integrated appropriately, and you can see those key universes that everybody has agreed upon really performing online, performing from a fundraising perspective, and obviously on election day, and so. It's a lot easier to do in a congressional race. It's more challenging in a statewide. And some of this on the presidential level is simply just an issue of scale, to be very candid with you. And so I think a lot of this is from a management perspective. How do you integrate it and manage it so that you're getting the information that you need, and so is everyone else in the organization, and that there's a level of harmony and understanding with regard to what's going on, because the moment and the chaos and all of that surrounds a presidential campaign can overtake you. So there's, I think that's just a critical piece of all of this.
That's a good perspective. Yeah. What do you think, Matt?
Necessary and not sufficient. So I think that the role of analytics needs to expand. Obviously, like a lot of the things I've talked about today are like taking a wider view of like measurement and taking principled stances on how we're even going to sort these things. But ultimately, campaign managers and leadership have to make hard decisions, and those are going to be supported by research that their analysts provide them. But one of the things that's most critical in sort of the interplay between a manager and an analyst is that the manager is defining the scope of the research because they're the ones who own the hard questions because they own the decisions. And so I think that...
And the budget is defining it for the manager.
That's right, that's right. So, we're like, you certainly cannot have a robot run a campaign because robots can't ask questions yet. So I think that as long as we haven't solved general AI, it is not going to be sufficient.
A majority, according to Pew, a majority of people think that robots are going to take over most jobs, but not their own. That most people don't think their own job is
Mine's
safe.
too important.
Okay. All right, John, go ahead.
My answer on necessary versus sufficient depends on what it is that you're solving for, right? So if you're solving for, so if you're maximizing the probability that you're going to win, then I would say it's neither necessary nor sufficient. You'll win. There's lots of people going to win races without having any analytics. Don't need analytics. Because the circumstances of that race, that district, that candidate means that's going to be a relatively straightforward race for them to win. And they don't need a turnout score to go out and make that happen.
You'd be a terrible data analytics consultant. With that answer.
I mean, couldn't you argue
No,
that Trump won with a less robust, we should say, or at least based on the coverage? What do I know from the outside? A less robust analytics department from what the Clinton campaign. So you could argue neither necessary nor sufficient.
My favorite thing about the campaign was how quickly after he won, we heard from his data and analytics people to tell us all the cool work they were doing that we didn't know about. So I would say that, though, but it is, if you're maximizing probability of winning, it's probably neither necessary nor sufficient. If you're maximizing efficiency, it's absolutely necessary. Right? So this is what the smart analytics people have always said to me and to my students when I bring them to my classes, is they don't, maybe I can get you a few points just total, right, at the end of the day. I'm a field goal unit, that's David Plouffe's favorite, famous comment. But they will say, look, if you're trying to get the most value for each additional dollar you have to spend, in terms of voter contact, in terms of paid media, or whatever it is, absolutely the data is necessary for doing that. I mean, you're probably not going to target at random, absent hiring Civis, right? But what Civis is going to get you in theory, right, over and above what you're going to be able to do on your own, is that every dollar you're going to spend is going to have a higher likelihood of reaching a voter that contact can affect in the way you want it to affect them. So to me, that's what it's necessary for.
Okay, well, sorry, we don't have time for questions, I'm afraid, because we had such a terrific, talkative, engaged panel. But they're still going to be around, I think, most of them. So maybe you can, shake them down if you have questions outside or at happy hour. So thank you to the great panel. Everyone give them a round of applause.